Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Whistleblowers within the probation service have told Sky News they no longer have sufficient resources to supervise offenders released into the community.
They say it's led to a big rise in reoffending rates for some of the most serious crimes. Our Home Affairs correspondent Mark White reports.
Cruel. Very, very cruel and unfair.
For almost 3 years, Nadine Marshall has been searching for the truth around the murder of her son. Connor Marshall was horrifically beaten by a convicted criminal in South Wales. David Braddon was serving a community sentence and being supervised by the local probation service. But he'd missed numerous appointments with his probation officer before going on to kill 18-year-old Connor.
When we got to the hospital, I just went to pieces then, because this poor boy was in a neck brace and just completely unrecognisable, and they took him through to trauma. We weren't allowed in.
Connor Marshall's death is an extreme example, but reoffending rates for some of the most serious crimes have increased by more than a quarter since the government reorganised the probation service 3 years ago, allowing the private sector to run regional services for low and medium level offenders. This probation officer turned whistleblower works for one of those private companies. Her identity protected, she told us staff numbers have been cut in half, but the caseload is as big as it ever was. The net result, offenders are no longer being properly supervised.
We have less time with our cases and rehabilitation has gone out of the window. We're being forced to telephone offenders because we haven't the time to meet them face to face. How then can you read body language to tell if they're reoffending?
And she's convinced the public are being put at risk.
There's absolutely no doubt that our communities are not as safe as they used to be because we're not able to monitor offenders effectively anymore.
Under the current system, alongside the private companies, a publicly run national probation service now manages the most serious offenders. But we've spoken to another whistleblower who tells us the national service has also become increasingly dysfunctional as it too struggles with significant budget cuts.
Since the breakup of probation, the workloads for the private companies and the National Probation Service have risen exponentially. We've got a shortage of staff, we're not training enough new staff, and that makes it very difficult for us to both protect the public and protect our staff. Some are increasingly going off with stress-related illnesses and others are quitting.
The government, still committed to making the new probation system work, has just bailed out the struggling private sector probation companies to the tune of £340 million.
I think the testimony of our members I trust, essentially. When people tell me that they're not seeing clients for 4, 5, 6 weeks face-to-face and that the only contact they have with them is by telephone, occasionally, then I think the public should have cause for concern at the impact on public safety and community safety.
Nadine Marshall says that the private sector, profit-making companies, should have no part in supervising criminals.
All the offenders seem to be slipping through the net, and that can't be a good thing for any community.
While acknowledging the probation system needs to improve, the Ministry of Justice says it's still committed to the reforms, which it's claimed have led to 40,000 previously unmonitored short-term offenders now being supervised. Mark White, Sky News.
Westminster were joined there by Labour's Shadow Justice Secretary, Richard Bergen. Richard Bergen, a very good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
What does a properly functioning probation service look like and what do we have?
Well, it certainly doesn't look like what we've got. I think Sky should be congratulated on their report into the reality of the failings of our probation system, because when the probation system doesn't work, and it's clearly not working, that's failing to protect society, and it's leading to more victims. And that's why in 19 of the 21 community rehabilitation company areas, in 19 of 21 of those areas, reoffending is up. And this all started with Chris Grayling's failed idea that if you handed these jobs over to the private sector, somehow things would get better. And what's happening now is the public purse is paying for failure, because, as your report said, the government has given over £300 million, £340 million actually, extra new money to these failing companies. Failure shouldn't be rewarded, and this has got to end.
Well, our report also says right at the end, it gives the Ministry of Justice an opportunity to comment on our report, and they do say that 40,000 extra people are being supervised in a way that they wouldn't have been pre-reform.
Well, reoffending has gone up in 19 of the 21 areas, and the reality is spelt out quite clearly by the inspectors of prison and probation, who actually said in a report that if you just removed any work by the community rehabilitation companies, full stop, that the impact would be negligible. So in other words, if they did nothing, there wouldn't be much of a difference in terms of the rates of reoffending. So reoffending has gone up, and your viewers are paying for that reoffending to go up, because these private companies are being given more money, and it's just not acceptable. So what we'd ask is for the government to think again, ditch its ideological obsession with the private sector always being better, and just let's have...
New Labour quite liked the idea as well, didn't it?
Well, we've moved on from that, and actually at the time that Chris Grayling and the Conservatives privatised and broke up our probation system, Labour forced a vote on that in Parliament at the time. So we were warning about what would happen if the Conservatives got the way on these privatisation, the privatisation of our probation at the time. We were warning then, probation experts were warning then, and it's now time for the government to not only listen at long last, but take action.
Mark White, our Home Affairs editor, in that report makes clear that there is a distinction between what's happening at the national level, which is still very much a public sector-led operation, the most serious potential reoffenders being dealt with there, and setting that against less serious reoffenders, potentially, where the private sector is much more involved. Are you saying there is no place within our probation service for any private sector involvement? Well,
the private sector is failing in probation, just as it's failing with Carillion, it's failing in prison maintenance contracts as well. A Labour government will bring probation back in-house, so it's run for the public good and for public protection, not for profit. Because what this shows as well is that those who've said that privatisation may be a bit messy, but at least it saves the public purse money, were sadly mistaken, because not only is this failing, but actually it's costing the public more money, throwing good money after bad, and that's not right at all, because it's society that's paying the price. If we're serious about reducing the number of victims of crime, and that's essential to Labour's justice policy, then we've got to make sure that probation works, because to fail to do so lets down society and creates more victims.
At the end of the day, dealing with recidivism, providing adequate opportunities for a genuine rehabilitation, it's incredibly expensive.
Well, it's worthwhile because we can't afford not to properly fund our probation service, because the price is paid by victims of crime where crimes shouldn't have been occurring, and when reoffendings occurred that shouldn't have occurred. But these contracts with these private companies aren't indefinite, and a Labour government wouldn't be renewing them. We wouldn't be continuing to throw good money after bad. It's not right that private companies are receiving public money whilst failing the public by actually seeing reoffending increase rather than decrease.
Richard Bergen, thanks very much.
Thank you very much.
Let's go back to that special report from our Home Affairs correspondent Mark White about the probation service and staffing levels. For more on that, we're joined from Cardiff by General Secretary of the National Association of Probation Officers, Ian Lawrence, who featured briefly in that report. Ian, good to have a slightly longer chat with you. Thanks for joining us.
Sure, good evening.
The problems, as highlighted in that report, down to privatisation or not?
Essentially, yes, because the probation service, before it was split up, was working well and was a gold standard service. And today in Wales here, we've been talking to the Welsh Assembly and stakeholders with an interest in the justice system here about how we can repair the damage that's been done. And politicians across the whole of the UK need to tune in and look at the problems being faced out there by our members.
Is there a minimum staffing level or a standard that private companies who get these contracts are required to meet?
Well, I'd like to tell you the answer, but I'm afraid we've never seen the contracts, and nor have many important people, let alone the people who are paying, namely the taxpayers. So I'd like to think there was a minimum benchmark, but when 2,000 staff have left the probation service in the last 3 years, when some of these private companies have reduced staffing by 50%, I think there's some serious questions that need answering.
Now, I'm looking at the Ministry of Justice's latest statistics, and it says that Band 3 probation service officers have increased, a 23% increase over the past year in the number of Band 3 probation service officers. Is that a good enough plugging of the gap?
Well, no, it's good, and we support all initiatives to improve recruitment, but you have a workforce where natural wastage is anything between 5 and 8%. You have, as I said, up to 2,000 people have left. We need to urgently invest in the probation service to make sure we get the right calibre of recruits coming in. And the private sector companies who are seeking to undercut terms and conditions at the expense of our members also need to be brought to book. How can you have unqualified people supervising potentially high-risk clients? We've seen the results of that in a number of serious further offences across England and Wales. In 2016, that spiked to 26%. There's a correlation that needs to be dealt with.
The reorganisation that took place in 2014 means that the high-risk offenders are still dealt with by the National Probation Service, publicly run. In terms of other medium and low-risk offenders, it is contracted out to private companies. But in terms of what the report that we watched highlighted in terms of just checking in with people who've been released over the phone, why is that necessarily a bigger danger to the public than checking in person?
Because any probation practitioner will tell you that they need to be in regular contact with a client to understand the change in their social, economic circumstances. Because whilst people may be classed as low and medium risk, the fact remains that they often present with a whole range of difficulties, mental health, substance and alcohol abuse, and the probation practitioner, supervisor, needs to know about their lifestyle changes to be able to reassess the risk. Risk is an ongoing thing. It doesn't just stay with you forever. And what we've seen with certain number of serious further offences is that people have slipped through the cracks, people have lost track because of overwork, because of sickness, because of stress, because of insufficient staff. And whilst I won't say that serious offences don't occur and never did, they are getting worse. And unless something is done to redress the imbalance in staffing and expertise, we are heading for a serious disaster.
OK, Ian Lawrence from the General Secretary of NAPO, thank you for your time.
Pleasure.